My approach to economics is that it has to be dynamic. And of course, these days you find both conventional economists and non-orthodox, the main non-orthodox school being Post Keynesian, saying they do dynamics in various ways. And I want to put a framework on all of this by starting with a quote from Robert Solow, who's the doyen of neoclassical economics in many ways and a Nobel Prize winner, of course, for growth theory. And this is his overview of what he thinks the current state of macroeconomics is like, meaning neoclassical. Maybe there is in human nature a deep-seated perverse pleasure in adopting and defending a wholly counterintuitive doctrine that leaves the uninitiated peasant wondering what planet he or she is on. And I think that just says what economics is like right now. And it's true in most ways of neoclassical, but there are ways in which the post-Keynesian is also quite flawed. And that's because they both use techniques that are either in violation of what modern dynamics is really about, and that's the neoclassical school, or in violation of common sense as well, which is also the neoclassical school, as Solow hammers very heavily, and certainly in ignorance of basic modern dynamics, which the post-Keynesian school is just as guilty of as the neoclassical, if not more so. And they both, and this is quite intriguing, they both use concepts which violate in some way the underlying paradigm you can identify for that school of thought. Because the neoclassical model, when you look at it carefully, has an unstable equilibrium as part of the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. That's outside the usual emphasis or belief that equilibria are going to be stable. And of course, they compensate for that by bringing in this twist into dynamic practice of what they call a jump variable. Well, the post-Keynesians, on the other hand, assume a stable equilibrium in the dominant models they use, which are stock flow consistent approach models, whereas previous post-Keynesian researchers emphasised instability and nonlinearity. And they're not there because that's incompatible with SCFA models. It's there because they think they've forgotten about them. I don't think it's been included by omission, not by a deliberate decision not to go that way. But if you look at modern dynamics, I think you can date the major change in dynamic practice in sciences in general from Rens's paper on deterministic non-periodic flow, where you found you had complex and aperiodic behaviour, even in a very simple model, and that you showed you can't linearise simple systems which have unstable equilibria, and you then get dynamic, which are far from equilibrium. And as a result of all this as well, you can't make accurate prediction without an infinitely accurate knowledge of the present because of the decay of data through sensitive dependence. And of course, I think another major defining paper, physics Nobel laureate, therefore a real Nobel Prize, and Philip Anderson, more is different, saying you cannot construct a model from its constituent parts. Now, none of this turns up in either neoclassical DSGE modelling or post-Keynesian CFA models. So, complex aperiodic behaviour, let's look at the Rens for a while. He rejected the linear approach to meteorology and constructed a very highly stylised, very simple nonlinear model, reducing a 12-equation partial differential system into 3 ordinary differential equations. But like a 2D slice of water, if you imagine just a layer of water on a hot plate on a stove, that's what it was like. This is a representation of what it's like, and you get these, I think, are called Bernard cells, rotating amounts of locations of water. Of course, they overlap, and this is the dynamics of that pattern of change is what he was investigating with this very simple model. So the Z dimension was the temperature gradient, basically how hot the plate was compared to the surrounding air. The X and Y is the location of the fluid, and it was symmetric, as you can see those two cells moving in opposite directions. So the Z and the X and the Y are symmetric rather than separate dimensions. And it reduces to 3 nonlinear differential equations with just 3 parameters. It's pretty hard to think of a simpler model than that. And the parameters were how viscous and how conductive the fluid was, the temperature gradient, how hot the hot plate was, and the width of the cell compared to the height of the cell. So you get this set of equations, and there are structural nonlinearities in these equations. This is the important thing that economists don't normally realise. They think nonlinear means having nonlinear behavioural relations. No, it means structural components of the system which are nonlinear because they're multiplied together or there's some non-additive product of of the important dimensions of the system. So those are the two in the Rens model. And when you solve it for what's the equilibria, the usual approach an economist would take, you get three equilibria. And when you analyse them, you find they're all unstable for realistic parameter values. So the zero is a saddle node repeller. It has two stable eigenvalues and one is unstable, all in the real plane. And the other two are cyclical repellers. They have one stable eigenvalue but two marginally unstable complex eigenvalues. So when you look at how it behaves, if you start an equilibrium, and this is modelling it in my Minsky software, if I can get where's my cursor? There it is. Okay, you model it in equilibrium, and it's a really exciting system. See the dot in the middle of the phase space and the straight line for the time? That's equilibrium. But if you you disturb it by even a tiny amount, then as soon as the disturbance occurs, off you go into a set of complex aperiodic cycles which generate a pattern. Of course, the butterfly pattern that people in this room would be familiar with. I think it would be probably an unfamiliar thing for a lot of economists to see that. But it shows you get the dynamics never return to the equilibrium. There's one equilibrium in the middle, again trying to get my cursor to work, one equilibrium there, one here, and one here. They're all unstable. So your dynamics, the equilibrium tells you where the system will never be. Okay? You need to analyse its characteristics, but you can't understand the system by extrapolating from the equilibrium. Nor can you use the linear approximation, because if you do a linear approximation at each of those three equilibria and then see what happens and compare it to the actual model, this is the sort of pattern you get. The black line is the actual Rens system. The other coloured lines, the two straight lines going away from the middle and the two orbits, they're the linearised versions around the three equilibria. Now, it is a totally different system. You cannot analyse it by focusing upon the equilibria. Okay? And that, again, is the insight which conventional economists, and for that matter, non-conventional economists, haven't put up with. And, of course, also sensitive dependence. So, again, something which is commonplace in the people in this room, but uncommon for economists. These are two simulations which differ by 1% in one measurement of the three dimensions. And for a while there's total overlap, and then at some point they're completely different patterns, which means, of course, you only have a limited range which you can forecast the system. So you can't make long-term prediction. You can make a window that is of some relevance on the timescale, and that's why we have such reliable weather forecasts in the medium term now. But you can't make precise predictions unless two things apply. One, you must have the correct model. So your model must be a complete simulacrum of reality. And secondly, you have to have an infinitely accurate measurement of the current conditions, which is impossible. And then finally, the wisdom which has come out of this and a whole range of other areas is that we know that reductionism has limits. And one thing that you can't do is to construct a high-level science from a lower-level one. And this is the beautiful paper More is Different by Philip Anderson made that point very eloquently. The ability to reduce everything to simple fundamental laws does not imply the ability to start from those laws and reconstruct the universe. And he called this Constructionist Hypothesis, and he said it breaks down when you have both scale and complexity turning up. The behaviour of large and complex aggregates of elementary particles cannot be understood as a simple extrapolation of the properties of a few particles, or in a neoclassical case, a single particle. So instead, at each level of complexity, entirely new properties apply, and then understanding those new behaviours requires research which is as fundamental as anything which is done at the lower level. And he said that one way you can look at this constructionist fallacy, which used to be part of sciences but died going on 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago now, he said you can array the sciences in such a way of having a table where you say science X obeys the laws of science Y. So the table looked like this. Solid state or many-body physics obeys quantum mechanics, particle physics. Chemistry obeys many-body. Molecular biology obeys chemistry, etc., etc. And you get social sciences, you've had psychology at the top there. Economists would dispute that. Of course, they're wrong. He said this hierarchy doesn't imply that science X is just applied Y. So at each stage, the new laws, new concepts require new inspirations. And he said psychology is not applied biology, nor is biology applied chemistry. And of course, in the case of economics, macroeconomics is not applied microeconomics. But that's how neoclassical economics treats it. So let's look at economic dynamics, and I'll put it in inverted commas for both schools. What are the defining aspects of the neoclassical school? There's a very good paper by Arnsberger and Varoufakis in 2006. They had three factors. I'm going to identify two here. Methodological individualism. You start from the individual, you must construct up. That's constructionism, which of course Anderson said is false and is right. And it also contradicts an important theorem in economics called the Sonnenschein-Mantel-Debreu theorem, which neoclassicals interpret as saying there are strict conditions, as they call it, on whether you can aggregate or not. And then they ignore those strict conditions and treat the entire economy as one agent. Those strict conditions are the same strict conditions under which complex numbers don't exist. All the square roots are rational. Okay? I think really you can see the SMD conditions as proof by contradiction that you can't aggregate. But they treat them as special conditions needed to do aggregation, which is sheer nonsense. And finally, secondly, methodological equilibrium. So all your analysis is around the equilibrium itself. The system's either there or very nearby, and everything has to be understood as a progression from one equilibrium state to another. Now, dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium models are entirely consistent with that first part of the methodological precepts of neoclassical economics. It's highly constructionist. So it derives macro from micro. And when you take a look at why they did this, this is the beauty of the internet these days. You can find all these statements. This is a speech by Robert Lucas, which was an extemporized speech. He made it, I think without any notes, to the History of Economic Society in 2003 in America when he was about to become the president of the American Economic Review Association, and saying, how did we go from ISLM, the previous macro, to modern? He said, well, nobody was satisfied with ISLM because it didn't fit with microeconomics. And our job is to tie that micro to macro. And he saw that as being the same thing in many other people he called Keynesians. I'd call Samuelsonians. But yes, it's this idea that you had to derive macro from micro. Although how did they do that? This is a choice, and Robert Solow emphasises this. They chose to use the neoclassical growth model, not Solow's simpler model from the 50s, but the model from Ramsey back in the 1920s. And that model has an unstable equilibrium. It's actually a saddle node equilibrium. But they chose that, and therefore they inherited an unstable equilibrium as part of their analysis. And if you look at what Ramsey was doing, he built an extremely idealised vision of a totally harmonious society, or one run by a totally benevolent dictator, let's say Joseph Stalin or Saddam Hussein or somebody like that. We have obviously benevolent souls, deciding what the savings rate should be for the indefinite future. And it reduced to two nonlinear equations for the time path of consumption and capital intensity. And in this vision of a totally harmonious society, then a social planner could pick the ideal time path, not just by saying what the end point was and the time path to get there, but also what your consumption would be today. So you'd modify everybody's consumption so the saving rate jumped from wherever it was to an ideal savings rate today, and then you have this entire time future to a point of bliss. Now, that was, in its bizarre sense of a vision of an ideal society, allowable for what Ramsey was doing. Ridiculous, but because it leaves out, it defines what is the ideal savings rate in a society by making a set of assumptions that eliminate the existence of capitalism, which is madness. It's not a society at all. But given that framework, okay, yes, you could imagine that there's such a central planet. But the model had a saddle point equilibrium, which is dynamically unstable. And the normal way it's shown is by a phase portrait like this that shows there's only one orientation that will lead you to the equilibrium position for those two dynamic equations. And if you look at it topologically, that's what you're looking at. You've got a saddle path equilibrium. If you happen to land right on that little spot there, I'm trying to bring my cursor into action again, then you could, if you threw a ball and it landed on that point, or if it landed on the ridge and ran up and down, then you wouldn't fall off and you'd finally settle where the dot is. But that's a definition of an unstable system. And mathematicians, before economists started using this tool, call that a saddle point equilibrium. Economists now call it a saddle path equilibrium because they argue you can locate it if you're simply rational. Yeah. Well, this is a change because in the past what they would do is either ignore instability. So if you look back in the 1950s and 60s, maybe even the early 1980s, when everybody who was doing a general equilibrium PhD thesis was building a computable general equilibrium model of some economy, and where that meant you had input-output dynamics and Leontief matrices and so on, they ignored the fact that that gave you what's called the dual instability, or they call it dual stability. It's actual dual instability. When you work out the mathematics, you've got a matrix which is positive, either positive or zero elements throughout the matrix. So positive, I think it's called positive semi-definite. Mathematicians here can correct me if I'm wrong. That then gives you a dominant eigenvalue which is greater than zero. The matrix will determine the quantity dynamics. The inverse matrix will determine the price dynamics. One or the other must have a dominant eigenvalue greater than 1. So whether you're working in continuous time or discrete time, either your price vector or your quantity vector will be unstable. Okay? They ignored that. Okay? But on they went until the research program fell apart. Or they redefine a system to eliminate that instability. So if you look at Harrod's unstable growth model, which was potentially another candidate, if they were going to have one unstable model, which is Ramsey, they could equally have chosen Harrod as their basis. But if you look back and see what happened to Harrod's model, Hicks took one look at it, saw the instability, made the mathematically invalid proposition that an unstable system doesn't oscillate, it just breaks down, which of course is valid for linear systems, but not for nonlinear systems. And then he said, let's bring in lags, because the great function of lags is to impart just that measure of stability to make the movement economically determinate. In other words, to eliminate the cycles that were part of the unstable system that Harrod had built. Well, instead of doing that, DSGE models invented a unique dynamic process, unique to economics. And that was this idea of an unbounded jump variable, which could be in a particular path in a phase space and then leap across that phase space portrait to land on the one and only one path that would lead you to the unstable equilibrium. So if you look at a normal system, this is the Van der Pol oscillator, then you have a whole range of time paths which don't intersect. Well, the neoclassical idea is you could start on one which was an unstable one and jump to some other path. So start here and jump there, or start here and jump there. In the original real business cycle models, instantaneously. Okay? But in the which we now call neoclassical, and what they call the new Keynesian, it doesn't happen instantly, it takes time. Still the same idea, just they've slowed down how fast it happens. So they imposed a stable outcome on an unstable system. Now, the justification for this takes all sorts of forms, but I was sent a book that my publisher thought I might want to use as a textbook. And reading through the thing, I just found this particular phrase and I thought, you have got to be kidding. So here's how this master's level textbook explains the idea that you can jump from an unstable path to the stable one. Because he finds, as I showed you in that phase portrait earlier, there are two, generally speaking, unstable regions, a bit like the stuff Luciano was showing yesterday, two paths that lead to breakdown, and one and only one, Lebesgue measure of zero, that leads to this stable point. He said, well, this looks quite arbitrary. This system may or may not involve stability. To resolve this, we apply the correspondence principle. It's another idea from Paul Samuelson. He says, we observe that in the real world, the instability prediction seems not to apply. News to me. Okay? Thus, we reject the unstable outcomes as mathematically possible, but inadmissible on empirical grounds. So come on, hello. Okay. When did he write this thing? After the global financial crisis. There's the date, 2014. That's when it's published. Instability seems not to apply. Maybe you should join me on my trip to Greece next week. Yeah. So that's what they did. They invented this jump variable to imagine that you have stability because the economy can jump to this vitally stable point. And that capacity is either instantaneous for the freshwater mob, as they call it, as Paul Krugman calls them, or slowly for the salt water. But ultimately, they both reach the same destination. And it depends upon an important thing called rational expectations. Only I think we should relabel it. It's not rational. It's prophetic expectations. Okay? And if you look and see, well, how did this idea come about? You find that it was used to eliminate the cobweb cycle in a model of agricultural trade. But why did we let them steal the word rational? Now here I'm quoting Robert Barro, who's one of the most extreme freshwater economists and responsible for a large part of what's happening in the EU policy these days, with arguments in favour of expansionary fiscal austerity and so on. He's really the originator of those ideas. And he made a comment in 1984 saying that one of the cleverest features of the rational expectations revolution, that's what they call it, was the appropriation. And notice that. We stole the word rational. Appropriation doesn't mean application. It means we steal it and give it a different meaning. And he said after we did that, opponents were forced into the defensive position of either being irrational or modelling others as irrational, neither of which are comfortable position for economists. Well, I reckon let's get comfortable again. I'm going to adopt the offensive position and describe what they call rational expectations as an encyclopedia would as the capacity to foretell the future. Having an accurate model of the future, of the present, and accurate knowledge of the present. That's not rationality, that's prophecy. So I'm going to call it the prophetic expectations hypothesis. And when they talk about model consistent rational agents, which is an essential part of their models, it's really the model consistent prophetic agent. Because since the agent is endowed with complete knowledge of the model the agent is in, and has the data of the model as well, it therefore neutralises any policy attempt to make things better than the system would be if you leave the model alone, which is a large part of what the Neoclassicals are on about. And the model consistent prophetic agent is what enables that jump to occur from an unstable point onto the saddle path. But that's logically irrational. If you really think this process through, the whole idea of a model consistent prophetic agent is irrational in itself. Because there's thousands now of different DSGE models, literally thousands. There's as many of them as there were computable, probably more than there were computable general equilibrium models back in the old days. Each of them has a model consistent prophetic agent. And the agent's deep parameters, as they call them, utility functions, rates of time discounts, etc., they're calibrated on real world data. But if there is such a thing as a prophetic agent, then he, and I've got to say it's got to be a God, okay? He, capitalised, exists in only one place. That's reality. So let's call him the RCPA, the reality consistent prophetic agent. Okay? That's the one they've calibrated all their models on. Okay. Now, his reality-based expectations will differ from the behaviour of every DSGE model unless one of those models, and only one of them can be, an accurate model of reality. Okay? Now, if such a model exists, and you put the reality-consistent prophetic agent's behaviour in that model, that agent will also only find the saddle path of that particular model if the data about the economy is infinitely accurate, which we know it's not. So if you put the reality-consistent prophetic agent, which is the only agent you should use, into any DSGE model, even the one that's accurately describing the real world, and have the data that describes the parameters, the behaviour of that agent calibrated on real world economic data, then that agent will not jump to the model's saddle path after a shock. Okay? The model will be falsely calibrated. There'll be errors in the data. It'll go to some other disequilibrium point. So you won't get the convergence they talk about. So the whole concept of a model-consistent prophetic agent is irrational. They're figments of the imagination of neoclassical economists. So the whole movement violates common sense. This is why I think Robert Solow really has to be given a very large stage, because he's been ignored by the neoclassicals themselves. And he said this wonderful expression saying that neoclassical macro does not pass the smell test. A great way of putting it. He's got a wonderful turn of phrase. Now, the United States Congress held a hearing into economic theory back in July 2010. A remarkable thing to have happen, of course, after the financial crisis, saying why did it happen and why did economic theory not warn? It's the same question the Queen asked at the London School of Economics, as Luciano pointed out yesterday. Well, one of the people they invited was V.V. Chari, who's one of the leading neoclassicals and a great supporter of DSGE modelling. And he was hammering the table saying how good this stuff is, and said a useful aphorism in macroeconomics is if you have an interesting and coherent story to tell, you can tell it in a DSGE model. If you can't do that, your story is incoherent. Right after they heard from him, the politicians then heard from Robert Solow. Same hearing, I think the same day. And he said, every proposition has to pass the smell test. Does this really make sense? And he said, current models take it for granted that the entire economy can be thought of a single, consistent dynasty carrying out a rationally designed long-term plan, disturbed by unexpected shocks, but adapting in a rational, consistent way. Of course, there are other models now with a couple of agents, or maybe 8. It's still the same basic structure in each agent. He said, I don't think this picture passes the smell test. The protagonists of this make a claim to respectability, asserting that it's founded on what we know about micro-behaviour. But he said that is generally phony. Tremendously honest language from I love the way he writes. Advocates no doubt believe what they say, but they seem to have lost their sense of smell altogether. They don't know they're in a shithouse. He said, and other times, he's been putting out papers like this for over a decade now. He said the puzzle he wants to discuss, and part of the puzzle is why his young colleagues don't think it is, he said that 40 years ago he worked out growth theory for the second time after Ramsey. He said it was clear from the beginning it didn't apply to short-run fluctuations in output and employment, the business cycle. He said now if you pick up any article today with the word business cycle in the title, there's a high probability that its framework will be real business cycle theory and the underlying model will be, as he called it, a slightly dressed-up version of neoclassical growth model. He said, how did that happen? Now, I can see a lot of history of economic thought reasons as to why it did, given the way the theories evolved, but he's completely flummoxed that this has now happened and he's now fighting against it. He said the main argument for it has always been an aesthetic one. It's supposed to be compatible with GE theory and therefore superior to ad hoc descriptions, which aren't related, notice, to this thing, deep structural parameters, one of the hang-ups of Lucas. He said that is misconceived. The cover story about micro-foundations can in no way justify recourse to the narrow representative agent construct. And he does actually mention the Sonnenschein-Mantel-Debreu conditions there. And he said the simple models, the RBC ones, right, which are what Krugman would call the freshwater models, have had little or no empirical success. So he said some of the free spirits, and here he's thinking of what we are now call new Keynesians, have begun to loosen up their basic framework by allowing for imperfections in the labour market, capital market, etc., etc. He said the model then sounds better and fits the data better. You're saying, well, wacky do, of course it does. The imperfections have been chosen to make the model fit the data better. It's overfitting the data, it's not explaining reality. And he then goes back in another paper looking at it and saying the preferred model, that the core model has a single agent optimizing over infinite time with perfect foresight, which realises plans more or less flawlessly through competitive markets, etc., etc. And he said very simply, how could anyone expect a sensible short to medium term macro to come out of that setup? And he said, I start from the presumption we want to account for the occasional pathologies that beset a capitalist notion. He said a model that rules out pathologies by definition is unlikely to help. But this has become the dominant strand in neoclassical economics these days. And he also, and this is important from the point of view that I'm coming from and Ping Chen and many others who are trying to bring in modern dynamics into economics, he said this focus on equilibrium is a false focus. He said, and he's talking at this stage in a festschrift to Joe Stiglitz in a building in the MIT. And this clearly, I think, was an extemporised statement, looking out the window on the 15th floor, and he said, if I drop a ripe watermelon from this 15th floor window, I suppose the whole process from T0 to the mess on the sidewalk could be described as some sort of dynamic equilibrium. He said, but that may not be the most fruitful, way to describe the falling watermelon phenomenon. Beautiful. But that's what they're doing. Everything's equilibrium, including dropping a watermelon out of a 15-storey building. So he's right. And the puzzle is, why does this modelling technique dominate? Why have people completely lost their sense of smell? And I think partly that diversity comment I started from is important. And Keynes made a very similar statement back in the general theory, saying the elegance, the counterintuitive results coming out of the theory seem to appeal to some part of people's natures. I'll put that in my paper, that particular quote from Keynes. But I think there's also an intellectual high from the incredible complicatedness of building a DSGE model. Having read through this literature and learning, following the logic of the Ramsey model and a standard DSGE model, it's incredibly complicated. It's really, really hard work to go from those first principles, falsely ignoring aggregation issues, to get up to the final stage where you derive a model. And a guy that I often have some battles with on the Twitterverse, but this I occasionally agree with him as well, is Noah Smith, who runs a thing called No Opinion. And he made this lovely comment some time ago saying a DSGE model is a Rube Goldberg, a series of carefully calibrated jokes to get you from your intuition or what you believe to a policy recommendation you like. Now, for those who don't know what Rube Goldberg is, he's an American cartoonist who designed these comically complex machines which are built for a simple purpose. So this particular one here is how to get an oil out of a long neck bottle. And it involves, it's got a clock, a label, a professor with smoking a pipe, a woman sitting on a chair, a fire, a rotor of some description, and then God knows what the final thing is for. Okay? Well, that's pretty much a DSGE model. They're about that complicated. And I think it gives them a thrill. You know? So what about the Post-Keynesian world? I don't think there's any chance of redeeming the Neoclassical approach. I've always been emphatic on that point, which puts me out of step with some people INET fund, but that's life. But I'm in step with the Post-Keynesian school. That's largely the type of approach I take. And I think they're innately superior for at least three reasons. Firstly, they take money seriously. Neoclassicals leave money out, even of the model including debt, done recently by Egerton and Krugman, ended up having debts and banks, but no money in the system. They don't use methods that expressly contradict modern dynamics, so therefore they're not inherently incompatible with what we've got out of complex systems. And if you look at what was done using that idea of sectoral balances, it enabled Wynne Godley to warn of the financial crisis long before it occurred. So here with this classic paper with Randy Ray back in 2000, is Goldilocks doomed? Goldilocks being the description of the Great Moderation. With Isureta, the case for a severe recession. And then again, weaknesses of the strong recovery, talking after recovery after the 2000 stock market crash. So those are three strong reasons why this is a far superior approach than 2005 as well, so all the way through. But they share some of the same weaknesses with the DSGE. For a start, the methodology is equilibrium dominated. And they are largely unaware of advances in complex dynamics. That's not true of Lance Taylor, but it's true, and Duncan Foley and a few others. But generally speaking, people who are doing this approach aren't aware of the advances in modern complex systems. And again, it's inconsistent with a large part of the original post-Keynesian paradigm. And there's also technical weaknesses. They normally use difference equations for entirely sloppy, poorly thought out reasons when differential equations are far superior. So the way they derive them is fairly straightforward. You start from a double entry bookkeeping table where all the row sums and zero sums must sum to zero, and you then derive a stock flow consistent transaction matrix. This is one from Godley and Lavoie in 2007, which has actually got a three economy model, so it's including an open sector as well. You can already see that's spelling up pretty complicated. You'll get eye strain trying to read all the entries there. Then they develop a set of generally linear, time-delayed. This is, I'm using the terminology of system dynamics here. They're not time lags, they're time delays. And they're generally first-order difference equations coming out of. I can't recall ever seeing one with T-2 in it. So here's a set of the first three equations and the final four equations in that particular model. So there's at least 80 equations. You know, 79 equations of that particular model. That's not a comment against it, but it shows how complex these models get to be. Complicated, not complex. And then they try to locate an equilibrium using numerical methods. And of course, this final result is a system with tens or hundreds of equations. But the usage is simple. You find all the equilibrium and you then subject the model to shocks in policy, which is just like what the Neoclassicals do. Take an equilibrium and give it a shock and see how long it returns back there again. So here's that same paper, and they introduce a shock in 1959 and see what happens to gross domestic product for those three different types of economy compared to a base level. Notice they all stabilise. So that's the sort of vision that they're implementing. Now, they're not doing anything as absurd as assuming a prophetic agent, but they make a lot of mathematical compromises to make their models tractable. For a start, the parameters they choose are chosen mainly for the stability, the values of the parameters, stability rather than realism. So Taylor, again, somebody who's aware of some of the problems here, pointed out that they sometimes use non-realistic values to get a realistic steady state. I'm sorry, you shouldn't do that. You use realistic measures, and if it's an unstable steady state, you've got an unstable equilibrium, big deal. And the time structure is quite haphazard, so they use difference equations and time delays for arbitrary reasons rather than because they're logically superior. Mark Lavoie is a lovely human being, great developer of this whole area, gave a talk in a UMKC just recently where Mark explained that the reason the time delays and difference equations are used because Wynne Godley used to work in an empirical role in the British Treasury. The data was quarterly or annual, and therefore he thought the natural modelling framework was discrete time. That's just not true. Okay? That is not a good reason to choose discrete time. You choose discrete time when you have a phenomenon which is precisely integrated, correlated. So all births, for example, we don't use difference equations to model human births. We model population growth using differential equations at the national level. You use difference equations for Christmas Island red crabs. Why? Because they're all spawned at exactly the same time. High tide at full moon once every year to flood the environment with prey so the predators can't wipe out the entire species. Okay? For coordinated systems, you use difference equations. You don't use it for asynchronous processes like human births or like investment and so on. And the time delays are arbitrary as well. And it's either simple one-period stuff, so everything is delayed by 1 quarter or 1 year, regardless of what it might be, investment, consumption, etc., etc. And often they bring in lags to avoid what, again, in system dynamics terms, are algebraic loops. And again, I don't think it's necessarily aware that's what they're doing, but this is Wynne Godley from 1999 saying, I've introduced lags into the consumption function and asset holding functions whenever simultaneous interdependence threaten to generate meaningless oscillations. That's just getting around algebraic loops. It shouldn't be there in the first place. Okay? So they consider chaos and complexity, but they don't integrate them. And this is from Stephen Cassell, another leading developer in this area, and again, somebody who's aware of many of the problems here. And I want to work with the school to get rid of these problems rather than saying they're terminal, of course. So Stephen, in doing his review, said there may also be a problem of chaos and complexity within these models. He said sensitive dependence doesn't mean intrinsic chaos or complex dynamics, but he said the recursive nature of the modelling, the existence of multiple feedbacks and the computational issues give me pause that there might be seeds of a complex system somewhere within stock flow modelling. Well, of course there should be. Isn't there might be? There must be, because there's almost certainly complexity in the economy itself. The fundamental structure is nonlinear, with things like weight modelling, multiplying the wage rate by labour to get your wage bill and then calculating profit as a residual. You've got an inherent nonlinearity just like those in the Rens model. The strong positive feedback loops that are everywhere, especially in finance markets and credit, and the uncertainty that we're embedded in, but the compulsion to act, which is clearly going to give you, that's the classic nonlinearity of all. You know, which way are you going to act? You can't say. That's a nonlinearity. So this should also be integrated, but why is it not? Why is it not there? It should be, because in the past, post-Keynesian authors have given us all these ideas even before physicists and mathematicians worked out complexity and chaos theory. So Chlosky, writing back in 1937, commenting on Keynes's work, said that talking about the idea that the level of investment is driven by the marginal efficiency of investment, as Keynes called it, in the general theory, which he began to abandon in the 1930s, by the way, 1937. But he said, let's assume that the rate of investment has really risen so much that the new level of investment prices and set of expectations gives you a marginal efficiency equal to the rate of interest, at which point investment should stop, according to the 1936 general theory version. Said, but the increase in investment will cause not just the price of investment goods to rise, but also other prices and employment. So because this change in situations changes long-term expectations, you won't reach the equilibrium. Investment will continue to rise past that point. And he then said, the Keynesian conception, which only tells us how great investment will be if a given disequilibrium changes into an equilibrium, notice these are Chlosky's inverted commas, encounters a difficulty because it appears the rise of investment does not lead to equilibrium at all. Non-equilibrium dynamics. That's Chlosky. Harrod, writing on unstable growth back in 1939, talked about having a unique warranted rate of growth. Either side there's a field of centripetal forces. Departure sets up an inducement to move further away. The moving equilibrium is highly unstable, so unstable equilibrium. Kaldor in 1940 and Cornet. Cornet is a very important, still alive and still writing, researcher who needs to be taken a look very carefully. A lot of good insights in Cornet. Kaldor as well. But Kaldor, writing back in 1940, said if you have a savings function and an investment function and treat them as linear, then you have two possibilities. Either the slope of the investment exceeds savings, so there'll only be an unstable equilibrium point, or the slope of savings exceeds investment, in which case any disturbance would lead you to equilibrium fairly rapidly. And he said, since neither of these two assumptions or outcomes can be justified, we're left with the conclusion that the functions cannot both be linear. So saying nonlinearity is essential. And he then said, and later on, and this is very similar to Cornet's arguments as well, prevailing theory of value, what he called equilibrium economics, is barren and irrelevant as an apparatus of thought to deal with economic forces. This is all in the post-Keynesian tradition. Goodwin, probably the most important neglected researcher in economics, in post-Keynesian economics, talked about Harrod's model and said how Harrod's model had to have nonlinearities, which were structural ones rather than endogenous. But he said if you have a linear pendulum, you can't explain oscillations we normally see, ones that don't die out over time. So self-maintaining cycles occur because of nonlinearities. He said, therefore, Hicks, because he has a model of both growth and cycles, must have nonlinearity. It's the essential role of nonlinearity. And then Minsky, writing in 1982, and this is in summarising the financial instability hypothesis, says the natural starting point for analysing the relation between debt and income is to take an economy with a cyclical past. So you've got a cyclical system that's now doing well. He said stable growth is inconsistent with the manner in which investment is determined in our economies. And the fundamental instability, again, of capitalist economy is upward. And the tendency to transform doing well into a boom is the basic instability. So throughout, the emphasis in post-Keynesian literature has been on instability. So you have unstable growth path, unstable equilibria, forces of growth and cycles intertwined, nonlinear relationships and truly complexity are all natural parts of the post-Keynesian vision. So why aren't they in stock flow consistent models? Why do post-Keynesians forget their history? And I think you can find a hint as to why, from why neoclassicals don't forget they forget their history, they don't forget their philosophy, because they've managed to hang on to constructivism and equilibrium despite using a model which is an unstable equilibrium. Why is that? Well, they've got a strong theory of value, the utilitarian, optimizing theory of value they have. Make sure that anybody who stays within that school adheres to those core concepts, even though the way they're manifested might change over time from general equilibrium meaning input-output dynamics to GE meaning optimization over time. So you have 1950s to 1970s computable GE, 1980s and on, you've got intertemporal optimization by a single agent in a single commodity world. They still use exactly the same phrase to describe both those very different concepts, general equilibrium. So they forget their history. They don't know why they abandoned computable general equilibrium. I don't know how many modern neoclassicals actually know that ever happened. But they don't forget their philosophy. That keeps them going. Now, it's highly flawed, and you can't construct the objective elements of reality you need starting from those subjective foundations, but it persists because it's so compelling to its adherents. Okay? Post-Keynesians forget their history and they don't have a philosophy. Okay? And that's why they forget their history, even though it's a good one. So I think we need a unified post-Keynesian methodology, and that means a paradigming defining theory of value. But what theory of value would that be? Well, it certainly can't be a subjective theory of value. It's got to be objective. The Neoclassicals have got the subjective. They've shown it doesn't work. They don't know they've shown that, but that's what they've shown. It can't be the Marxian labour theory of value either, because that's got logical flaws. The transformation problem was pointed out back in the late 19th century. Schaffer's critique, the Schaffian critique as done by Ian Steedman, is entirely justified. And it's also, I argue, this is a paper I haven't emphasised much in most recent years, but I'm going to do a lot more in future. The labour theory of value is inconsistent with Marx's own philosophy. The first two papers I published in economics were on that topic back in 1993. And if you take a look at his logic, his dialectic contradicts the labour theory of value. Marxians don't like that, but it's reality. So we can actually build an objective theory of value on that foundation and have subjective elements as well coming naturally out of a dialectic as you look at higher and higher layers of society. It can be done. And we also have to reflect in that objective reality what we didn't know in the 19th century, what Marx didn't know as well, and those are the laws of thermodynamics and the role of energy and exergy and entropy in production, which are all completely absent, not just in neoclassical economics, but in post-Keynesian as well. We have to include those. And I believe it's feasible to do that. We could use Marx's dialectics and Georgescu-Rogin's inspired work about ecological economics, particularly looking at the work being done by Bob Ayres and colleagues at the moment, which are really developing an energy-based theory of production. That can be done. But that's a topic for another day. I've gone on almost long enough already. I think I'm getting close to my time limit here. What I want to talk about very rapidly now is a practical contribution I'm making, which is a model called Minsky, a software package called Minsky. And it's still in its infancy. I've used about $200,000 worth of programming time to build it so far. It's designed to build monetary models easily. And it does that by having interlocking double entry bookkeeping tables. This is a screenshot of one of those tables where I'm simulating austerity versus stimulus programs. I think I've got that running, let's see, okay, in the background here, so I can run the system here and let it buzz away, and I can, so if the government suddenly decides to go for austerity, then good night economy. So I'll be talking a bit about that in Greece tomorrow. So that's the impact of austerity and other changes. Actually, I haven't actually generated a cycle before. I better go and check the parameter values of that one later. Okay. Right. So I've got that far, and it also lets you build complex systems. So the simulations I've shown you earlier of the Rens model and so on have been built very simply in Minsky. I've stolen ideas from open source programs, and I think I've improved on them, and I've got a brilliant programmer writing the software for me. So it's easier to build those sorts of models in Minsky than I think in many of the competitors, if not all of them. But it doesn't yet enforce stock flow consistency. I've made errors in some of my own models by having stock flow inconsistency. So we want to get rid of that capability, the problem of actually being able to build a stock flow inconsistent model. And I won't be able to do any more until I get more funding. But the intention is to enforce stock flow consistency, to show when you've got that as well as getting the financial flows correct, to automatically generate the stock flow consistent equations for the researcher without the need to work out which equation to drop, to enable multi-sectoral modelling, so you have monetary input-output dynamics by cloning a single sectoral model and then generating automatically all the interrelations between sectors, and by having multiple countries. Make a model of one country, clone it, you've got a model of international trade and financial flows, all generated by the software, all the equations given for you. And then bring in integrated data handling as well, so you can do nonlinear parameter estimation, because part of the appeal of the neoclassical school is they have all these tools. They're pretty clumsy. Packages like Dynair, I think, are pretty ugly pieces of software, but they exist. And that's, therefore, the community is using a common set of tools. Again, a major advantage they have over post-Keynesians. And also an intention ultimately is to integrate Minsky with multi-agent modelling, and that'll be easier than you might think it is, because the programmer who does the code for me, Russell Standish, originally built a model of evolutionary multi-agent interaction he calls Ecolab, and that's what Minsky's built on top of. So it'd be quite easy to link up with those multi-agent layers down below. So I want to finish by, first of all, returning back to the whole issue of mathematics and how badly economists have done that. And here's a couple of mathematicians' views on economic dynamics. I only heard about this one yesterday. I'm not being a mathematician. I didn't know of the prodigy Steve Smale, who's in his 80s now, but definitely deserves being called the prodigy, and a list of 18 unsolved problems he wrote at the end of the last century, last millennia actually. And number 8 on his list was Introduction of Dynamics into Economic Theory. That's from the Wikipedia. Still true. We haven't yet done it. And this is another mathematician I greatly admire, an Australian, or Austrian-born Australian-based mathematician who died back in the 80s, John Blatt. But in a book called Dynamic Economic Systems, he said that talking about dynamics in economics, he said, a baby is expected to crawl, then walk, and then ultimately run. He said, but what if a grown man is still crawling? He said, at present, the state of economic dynamics is more akin to a crawl than a walk, to say nothing of a run. And he said, indeed, some may think that capitalism as a social system may disappear before its dynamics are understood by economists. I think that's a fairly valid statement, still today. So we must embrace complexity to do what Smale said, introduce dynamics into economic theory. The neoclassical paradigm cannot do that because that would mean becoming non-constructionist, having far from equilibrium dynamics, and have permanent non-optimal situations, all of which is an anathema to the neoclassical paradigm. The post-Keynesian paradigm can do it. It would be stronger if it did it. And many of the historical insights I covered are actually precursors to what we now know as complex systems. And a dialectical theory of value coming out of Marx and rejecting the later theory of value as well would also be compatible with complexity. So there's much work to be done on the mathematics and the philosophy of post-Keynesian economics. And I'm glad to be saying that at this particular school. But I have one as well I'd like you to come and join me at some stage, Kingston University in London, which I'm now the head of. Thank you very much.